Hey film fans, what's up? Throughout this series, I've been referring to this idea that the 1970s was an era of male-driven cinema, a sort of masculine, macho era where these male geniuses kind of took over the system and imposed their will upon it. And there is some truth to that. When we think about the films of the 70s, we think about Scorsese, Altman, William Friedkin, Hal Ashby, Peter Bogdanovich, Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas. But almost all those filmmakers had something in common, which is that they relied heavily on the work of women to make their films come together. Join me in this video as we talk about the women of the 1970s as we continue to consider the rise and fall of New Hollywood. Hey everybody. Before we consider the women of 1970s Hollywood, we should have a little historical context so we can better understand why it was so important that these women were involved in the making of films in that era. Let's go back in time to the early days of cinema. The early days of cinema were kind of non-hierarchical. There were no studios, there were no institutional structures imposing their idea of who could make films on the filmmakers. There were financial barriers. You needed to be able to afford the equipment. You needed to be able to afford processing the film. You needed to be able to get your film out, to distribute it. And these have always been the issues around filmmaking. The costs of production, the costs of distribution, and the costs of exhibition. Talked about them in previous videos. And there's some great stuff written about the sort of financial power dynamics of the early years of film. I'm talking late 19th century, early 20th century. Then in the early 20th century, companies did arise, Edison, for example, in the United States, and then soon after that, Biograph and other companies that were hiring talent, and they would sometimes impose sort of rules on who could do what. But the idea that one person did this job and only this job, one person was the director and one person was the cinematographer, those weren't just naturally born out of cinema, right? It took decades for those kind of roles to fall into place in the way that we think they do now. And during this era, women were heavily involved in filmmaking. Women were directing films, they were writing films. It was a different process than it is today because films for the most part were silent, so they weren't writing sort of screenplays, but scripting these scenarios that would then be used as kind of blueprints for shooting. Women were obviously acting in films, they were producing films, paying for films, and so on. And they were heavily involved. And a lot of these women were kind of forgotten by most sort of mainstream film history for a long time, but researchers are discovering more and more all the time that some of the greatest early films were made by women. Alice Guy Blaché, for example, is someone you should definitely know about, who made what we think is the first feature-length film in movie history. Lois Weber in America, in the teens, for a while was the highest paid director in Hollywood. And this was all happening before the studio system kind of coalesced in the early 20s. But even throughout the 20s, as the studio system was falling into place, women were involved in the writing, the filming, and definitely the editing of films. In fact, in the teens and 20s, women made up a huge percentage of the editors in America. And at the time it was considered, and you see this written about a lot, kind of piecemeal craft work, almost akin to sewing. Movies were shot on less film, and there was a pretty clear pattern to follow. This scene comes first, this scene comes first, this scene comes next, and so on. And women were often hired to stitch, metaphorically, the films together. By the end of the 20s and into the 30s, a few things happened that changed women's roles in filmmaking. There was a lot that went on there, and I can't unpack this in the next 2 minutes, but 3 things are worth considering. First one was the rise of unions and guilds, and I'm pro-union, I'm pro-guild, But we have to remember, as institutions, unions, like any other kind of large body, were affected by the culture of the time, and the culture of the time was heavily kind of patriarchal and misogynist, and institutions were created by and run by men, oftentimes for men. So once that kind of hierarchical structure of the union came into place, it made it easier for men to hire men. Hollywood unions and guilds have very strict rules about who can be admitted, and they have very strict rules about who can work on a film. So you can't work on a film, a Hollywood production, if you're not in the union or the guild. You can't get into the union or the guild without a contact, someone to vouch for you, and so on. So that effectively barred women from joining a lot of these craft unions and guilds, barring them from working on films. A second thing that happened was the coming of sound. The coming of sound had drastic consequences for a lot of people in Hollywood.
And I can't stand him.
And I can't stand him.
But also for women working behind the camera, particularly editors and writers. And the reason for this was that editing now became more than just a kind of a craft. It was a skill or an art. When you're dealing with the editing of sound, when you're dealing with overdubs, when you're dealing with J cuts and L cuts, when you're dealing with sound design and then editing sound design, all of a sudden now it's not just, ooh, she's over there taping film together, as if that's what it ever actually was, but, ooh, there's an artistic element to this. Okay, let the men step in and take over. That's a kind of facetious way of putting it, but that is basically what happened. And you look in the early days of cinema up through the 20s and you see all these women film editors, and by the mid-30s, almost all of them have dropped out. You have Anne Bauschens, who was a favorite editor of Cecil B. DeMille and continued to work with him throughout his career. And you have Anne V. Coates, who was heavily relied upon by filmmakers like David Lean. But they were special. They had developed relationships with the industry, and their directors came to rely upon them, as directors often do with their editors. And so they were able to continue working. And the other effect of sound was on writing. In the early days of cinema, writing was, here's the story, and this is what we're going to see in this scene, this is what we're going to see in this scene. With sound came dialogue. With sound came a different way, a different necessity for writing scripts. And the writers moved in. Again, mostly men. Women lingered in screenwriting longer than they did in editing. Women even won some Academy Awards for screenwriting in the 30s. But slowly, with the exception of some kind of high-profile writers like the writers Dorothy Parker or Lillian Hellman, who kind of transferred their fame as fiction writers and playwrights into Hollywood success, or some success, it was mostly taken over by men. The third development in the late 20s was the beginning of the Academy Awards. Now, why might that be? This is harder to trace, and I'm going to say right up front, this is kind of a little bit speculation on my part, but remember, the Academy Awards were created by the Hollywood studios. Louis B. Mayer and some of the other studio heads were like, we should recognize ourselves. It was also PR. In the late 20s, when the awards were created, Hollywood was getting flack from censorship boards around the country. And I talked about that in my Industry Roots video in this series. And they wanted to promote the glamorous side, the artistic side, very important, of Hollywood by creating this award ceremony that they could then publicize, and the stars would show up in their gowns and tuxedos and look beautiful. And again, this is a kind of male mindset. They wanted the awards. I mean, everybody wants the award when there are awards available, but the idea that now we were getting a kind of artistic recognition for filmmaking, however manufactured it was by the studios, meant that there was something more to it than just making the movies. There was art, there was recognition. And so as the studio system started to impose its kind of hierarchical structures on the hiring of men and not women, it was natural that they would also give those awards to themselves, to men. So what you have by the middle 60s is 30-ish years of women being effectively barred from Hollywood production, at least from these sort of below the line but well-established roles like cinematographer, definitely, editor, writer, producer, no. There were a couple directors. Dorothy Arzner, who got her start during the silent era and continued to direct into the sound era, and Ida Lupino, who started out as an actor and who acts in some of her own films, and who had a fairly successful career as a director in the kind of middle to the tail end of the studio era. And that's it. Now, there's a lot of great research that's going on right now about women who were in lesser positions, script girls, continuity girls, assistants to producers, assistants to directors, who actually had a lot more responsibility than their male counterparts let on, than history has sort of heretofore understood. And there's great research that's going on that's uncovering what these women actually did and how important their roles actually were. I'll drop a link below to a great article by the film scholar Helen Hansen that talks about that. I highly recommend this book, Never Done, by Erin Hill, A History of Women's Work in Media Production, which is a fascinating look at all the contributions, all the labor, all the creativity that women who have been marginalized or sort of ignored by history, all the work and creativity that they've actually brought to Hollywood throughout its history. The one big exception to this, of course, was Edith Head, who was a costume designer who worked on films for Hitchcock and everybody in the 50s and 60s, and who designed Grace Kelly's dresses and so on, and kind of lorded over her costume fiefdom, making these beautiful outfits that we kind of, if you think of beautiful clothes in 50s films, probably there's a good chance they were designed by Edith Head. But by the time we get to the middle to late 60s, what you have is effectively 30 plus years where women have almost been barred from the production, the crafting, the making of films. So what changed? There are a number of changes that went into the process of opening the door, or let's say cracking the door in the mid to late 60s to allow women to re-enter the industry. And let's remember, this is a re-entry, not an entry. It's a re-entry because women were integral to the rise of filmmaking in the United States. And then they were basically barred for the reasons we've talked about. And in the middle 60s, they started to come back in, trickling, and then in bigger numbers, and then in bigger numbers. Why? Well, the generational change was an important part of it. The baby boomers were young. They were in their early 20s, mid 20s, coming up on their 30s. And they had a different mindset about equality and things like that. And it's easy to look back on them now and say, okay, boomer, and get upset about them being old, but they haven't always been old. And they did have these ideas about equality and so on. But more importantly than equality was, who can do the job? Who can make my film look better? And I don't mean this in sort of sense that often gets used today, that like, oh, if women were good enough, they would get the job. Because that's clearly still not 100% true. But at the time it was like, I want my film to be as good as possible, and I know this person and she does a good job, so of course I'm going to hire her. It wasn't a sense of full equity, it was a sense of, I'm going to use her to get this done because she'll be good at it. As I pointed out in earlier videos, the studio system had crumbled. That let's not say crumbled, but was crumbling. And that hierarchical top-down, the studio head's going to dictate to everyone who's going to work on this film, was basically gone. That producer unit system was gone, and now we had this package unit system that I've talked about, where the production company or the star, Warren Beatty in the case of Bonnie and Clyde, or an agent, a casting agent, were putting together deals, and they wanted to put together the best team they could get, but also a cost-efficient team, and yes, women were paid less. Hollywood was going through financial struggles, as I've talked about. So if they could put together a package, ooh, and we're going to save on the editing because we're going to hire a woman instead of a man, they would do that, right? So it's not all like wine and roses, women are equal. A lot of it is more cynical stuff. I can get her, she's good, and she's cheap. Let's do it. But that idealistic fervor was part of it too. I don't mean to discount that, but that wasn't the only thing. And then you had women who were baby boomers and who had been raised to believe, like a lot of boomers had, that they could do whatever they wanted if they worked hard enough, and a lot of them wanted to work in film. And some of them had to kind of bang their way in the door, and they had to put up with a lot of sexism, sexual harassment, a lot of belittling of their talent on sets, in editing boxes, and elsewhere. And they still did it because they loved their work. And if you read accounts of Polly Platt and Dee Dee Allen and Marcia Lucas, the way they were often treated, not necessarily by the big names, but sometimes, was often dreadful. And the fact that they stuck it out is sort of testament to their perseverance and their dedication to their art. So you had a lot of different factors going in here. Generational change, institutional and industrial necessity, pure cynicism, that resulted in an environment where Hollywood was like, all right, you can work on this film. All right, yep, let's see what you've got. Prove yourself. And it wasn't just prove yourself on this film. It's prove yourself on every film. Prove yourself again. Prove yourself again. Prove yourself. You failed. You're done. Right? Elaine May. Get to her in a minute. So what I want to do now is just talk about a few different areas where women began to excel in the 1970s. First up is editing. And this is the one that everybody seems to know about because there are a lot of women editing films in the 1970s. I've already talked about Dee Dee Allen and Verna Fields in my video about crew members. These women, especially Dee Dee Allen and Verna Fields, had actually started earlier in the 60s, but they really came into their own working on new Hollywood films. Dee Dee Allen with Bonnie and Clyde, Verna Fields with Peter Bogdanovich's films, and then of course Jaws. And they had an approach to editing that made their work feel fresh. They were less hung up about foregoing standard editorial practice from Hollywood history and more interested in, I mean, it would be a stretch to say experimenting in the sense of this is experimental film, but experimenting with new ways of editing that might look kind of mundane to us today, but were quite fresh and quite almost out there at the time. So for example, Dee Dee Allen developed a habit of skipping 2 shots. So if you know about Hollywood continuity editing and coverage and things like this, a standard approach to filming a scene, particularly a dialogue scene, is to do a wide shot, a coverage shot, an establishing shot. There's different ways to describe it. So if 2 people are talking in a restaurant, we might start with a kind of wide shot of the whole restaurant and we can see where they are, and this establishes the scene. There's the 2 people. This is a restaurant, a diner, a fancy restaurant, whatever it is. Then the next step, once that's been established, we might hold that shot for 3 seconds, and then we cut to what's called a 2-shot or a 2-header. There's different terms for it, where we see the 2 people in a kind of medium shot. They're both in the frame, but they take up much more of the frame. In the establishing shot, they're back in the corner, and now we're up where we see the 2 of them talking. And then we cut to what's called shot, reverse shot. So we see a shot of the person talking and the other person's not in the frame. And then we cut to the other person talking when it's their turn and the first person's not in the frame. Shot, reverse shot. And sometimes editors would play around with reaction shots. So we'll cut to a shot of this person talking and then the other person who's off camera delivers their line so we can see this person react. And then when they start talking, maybe we cut over to this person so we can see them react. but it's the same principle, shot, reverse shot. And Dee Dee Allen would skip that 2 shot. So she'd go from the establishing shot to the close-up. Big deal. People do this all the time now. The rules of editing of continuity style are rarely adhered to religiously. They're still adhered to, but rarely adhered to religiously like they were in the 40s and 50s. That seemed like a big deal at the time. That was a fresh approach. And she talks about, like, I just felt like we didn't need that shot. The audience knows where we are. Let's just get in there. Oh, why didn't I think of that before? This is the sort of take that Dee Dee Allen brought to making films. And that would have huge effect on filmmaking throughout the 70s, because all of a sudden the idea came that I don't need to show the audience everything. I can cut out parts of the story maybe. So we get a scene in the Last Picture Show when Dwayne and Sonny decide they're going to go to Mexico, and they get in the truck and they say goodbye to Sam and they drive off, and we cut to them driving back, and they're sick. They've got their Mexican hat. Again, today this seems like no big deal, but at the time, Polly Platt talks about how she felt like, we can't do this. We have to show them in Mexico. We have to show something. We can't just have them leave and then come back. Films do this all the time now. But that kind of approach was built on techniques that people like Dee Dee Allen developed. And Bogdanovich would end up working not with Dee Dee Allen, but Verna Fields repeatedly on his films from targets throughout the 70s. So the important thing to remember is not just that there were a lot of women editing in the 70s, but that they were bringing new approaches to storytelling. And I've linked previously to the YouTube video about Marcia Lucas's editing on Star Wars and how she actually changed the end of the film in the editing. She changed what happened. She went off the script and gave the ending the power that it has through her editing, through her understanding of how editing directs the viewer through the narrative. We often watch films and we think, oh, I'm attracted to the story or I'm attracted to the characters. And that's true. But it's the editing that guides you from one narrative or character beat to the next so that you can maintain that attentiveness, maintain that relationship. And these women who were working in the 70s developed new ways of directing the audience through those narrative and character paths. Here are just a few films edited by women in the 1970s. More women writers also started to emerge in the 70s. Women had been writing throughout the classical era, but as I said earlier, oftentimes they were already established as playwrights or novelists, and their success in those fields would attract Hollywood producers to kind of poach them out of fiction or drama. But for the most part, for a woman to come up with a spec script and say, here, will you make my film, was not something that happened. And that started to change with people like Carol Eastman or Nancy Dowd. And these are two women who, if you go research them a little bit, had a very hard time. Carol Eastman actually often wrote under pseudonyms because she was sort of horrified by her treatment as a woman in Hollywood. And Nancy Dowd also had a lot of problems with the way she was treated in Hollywood, and I'll put some links to stuff about them below. But there are also more established women who'd been writing in the 60s into the 70s, and they often got by changing their names. And we have people like J. Preston Allen and Lee Brackett, huge film writers in the 70s who got their starts earlier. And there are also a lot of women who did writing in the 70s for their own films, but also script doctoring for others. For example, somebody like Elaine May, who made 3 films in the 70s, 3 fantastic films. If you want to see my video on The Heartbreak Kid, that's right there. but also did a lot of script doctoring and working on other scripts for people like Warren Beatty. Polly Platt, who I'll talk about again in a minute, wrote her first film with her husband, or I think she gets a story by credit now, Targets, and never got another writing credit until she wrote her own film at the end of the 70s, Pretty Baby. But her effect on every script that she worked on is massive. She often cut scenes out. She often suggested new scenes. She changed the location of her films. What's Up Doc was supposed to be in New York. She decided it should be in San Francisco. You don't get that chase scene at the end of the film if it's not in San Francisco. Paper Moon was originally supposed to be in Alabama, which is where the book is set. She decided to change it to Kansas. You don't get those beautiful shots by cinematographer Laszlo Kovacs if it's not in Kansas. You don't get that kind of Depression era emptiness, that thematic feel of the film if it's not in Kansas. Even on smaller films like The Thief Who Came to Dinner, which was originally set in Chicago, Polly Platt's like, no, let's do it in Houston, and there's a lot of interesting reasons why. In The Bad News Bears, which she was production designer on, the original script had a bunch of scenes in all the kids' houses, so we got to know a little bit of their background, see them interacting with their parents, having breakfast and stuff like that. And the idea was that once we saw them on the field, we'd understand them better and know why they acted the way they did. And Polly Platt had the idea that no, in this movie, the baseball field is life. The baseball field is the home. And they cut, at her suggestion, all those domestic scenes, and almost the entirety of the film, with 3 or 4 exceptions, happens on the baseball field. But she doesn't get a script writing credit for that, and maybe she shouldn't. The Writers Guild has rules about how much of a script one should write, and those rules are important because they protect writers' rights and so on. But the point is that a lot of women were writing scripts in the 70s, but a lot of women were also influencing scripts in major and dramatic ways. Polly Platt wasn't just someone with good ideas. She was a production designer and costume designer who worked on films throughout the 70s, and I would argue had a major impact on how New Hollywood films looked, with a handful of other production designers, and I talked about them also in my video on the crews of the era. But Polly Platt's ideas about how to make film and how to shoot on location, how to design a film so that it looked realistic, were massively influential on not just the 70s, but Hollywood since then, right? One of the things we praise about Star Wars is that Star Wars was a lived-in universe. And when we compare the original trilogy to the prequel trilogy, one of the big negative criticisms of the prequel trilogy is that it looks too new, it looks too shiny. Now, I'm not going to say that Polly Platt influenced George Lucas's production design on Star Wars, but as early as The Last Picture Show in 1971, you have Polly Platt saying, I don't want people wearing new clothes. I don't want anything new. This town, Anne Arene, Archer City, Texas, wouldn't have new stuff. They found the building where all the pool hall scenes are shot, which was actually a card-playing dominoes hall or something like that. And the windows were all greasy and the paint was peeling, and you know, her crew came in and said, oh, we'll clean this up. And she's like, no, don't, leave it. This is what the place looks like. Leave it like this. And she had this sense, Frank Marshall said, she never wanted anything new. She also did costume design, and she's talked about how one of her favorite things is to put characters in clothes that don't quite fit, right? And she was responding to the sort of Edith Head 50s era, everything looks perfect. She's like, nothing looks perfect. How do these women in movies wake up and their face and their hair is perfect? I never wake up with my face and hair perfect. The women in my movies aren't going to. And if you look at someone like Cloris Leachman in The Last Picture Show, then you get this sense that the approach to realism in the film is there's such a commitment to it that the performers, you know, are willing to look bad. I mean, they're still Hollywood performers. Look bad on camera. And this goes up into her 80s work too. So there's a famous instance from Terms of Endearment, which she also produced, where when Shirley Maclaine, who plays Aurora, her daughter, gets ill, she kind of leaves her prim and proper life behind to help take care of her daughter. And throughout the film, the first hour and a half, she's been always sort of meticulously dressed and made up. And if you watch the last half hour of the film as she's taking care of her daughter, Deborah Winger, her roots start to grow out. This was Polly Platt's idea also. She's like, we need to show somehow that she's given up on the things that seemed important to her before so she can take care of her daughter. And Shirley Maclaine was resistant to this. She's like, I don't want to do that. She was turning 50. She probably had things going on in her own life. I can relate. And Polly Platt's like, it will make the film better. And she did it. And you can see how the roots get longer. They must have dyed them in the wig. She's wearing a wig. The roots slowly get a little bit longer. Her hair gets a little unkempt. And the interesting thing about it is, at first, it just looks like her roots are dark. But by the time we get to the famous scene with her and Jack Nicholson telling each other they love each other at the airport, she's wearing her hair down long and the roots are there. She's kind of, Aurora, the character, has grown into a sort of different kind of, a new kind of beauty, which is different from her more sort of heavily made up and meticulous beauty from earlier in the film. That's the influence of a production designer like Polly Platt, the influence she had on Hollywood film. And when you look at films today and they look lived in, they look real, they look beat up, characters look uncomfortable because of the way they're dressed, a lot of that, not all of it, a lot of that comes from Polly Platt's production design in the early mid-70s into the early 80s. The directors. We think of the 70s as a director's cinema. I've talked a lot about auteurism, I've talked a lot about the movie brats, and the way we frame Hollywood history in the 70s is that it's a director's cinema, and since only men were directing, it's a male cinema. And again, there is some truth to that because the structures that were in place, that had been in place since the 20s, were still there. They were crumbling and modifying, and cracks were allowing change to come through. But when it came to the director's chair, there was still a sense throughout the 70s that women just didn't have it. They just didn't have, whatever it was, the ability to marshal all those departments. The creativity. They didn't have genius. And this, as we know, is completely false. And if you just go out and track down the magnificent films directed by women over the last 50 years, you'll see how ridiculous this notion was. But it was widely held, and a lot of the women who tried to direct met resistance after resistance. Joan Micklin-Silver, I mentioned this in one of the videos I did about her, was told, like, making movies is enough of a headache. I don't need to add a woman into the mix. So even though studios were like, okay, you can edit this film, we're gonna pay you half. You can production design on this film, we're gonna pay you 2/3. And there were union rules, they weren't paid pennies, but even though studios were willing to do that, when it came to directing, they were a lot less willing to do so. And this has to do with sexism, this has to do with auteurism, this has to do with the sexism of auteurism. But we still get some great films directed by women in the 70s. In the studio system, very few. Elaine May made 3 films in the 70s and 1 in the 80s. As I said, I've done a video on The Heartbreak Kid. She also made, before that, A New Leaf, fantastic comedy with Walter Matthau. And then a completely different film, Mikey and Nicky. If you like the 70s, you have to see this film with Peter Falk and John Cassavetes basically doing a two-hander and just knocking it out of the park in this sort of cynical, dark, sad crime friendship story. It's just fantastic. Joan Darling, who made the film First Love for Paramount in 1977. That's about it for the studios. If you want to see women directors, you got to kind of step outside the studios, and there's a lot of films I've talked about before, like Barbara Loden's Wanda. Every fan of 70s cinema, you have to see this film. Joan Micklin Silver completely financing her films, their production, their distribution, their exhibition, and getting massive accolades, even though Hollywood wouldn't let her make a film in the system until the 80s. But I've done videos on her films, Hester Street and Between the Lines, two great films from the 1970s, two very different films. Hester Street is set in a sort of Jewish New York City ghetto in the late 19th century, and it's about immigration and assimilation. And Between the Lines is set in Boston in the 1970s, a very contemporary sort of loss of the hippie dream film about a small independent newspaper that's kind of falling apart and in danger of being bought up by a big conglomerate. Both are fantastic films, and I've done videos on both. There's Hester Street and Between the Lines. It's tempting to look around today in 2021 as I'm making this film and say, women have it so much better, and they do. But women still direct roughly 20% of Hollywood films, and that number holds around the world. You might get to a country like Sweden where it gets closer to 30%, but it hovers around 20%. It's like that is the glass ceiling, or as we call it in film studies, the celluloid ceiling, that 20%. And sometimes in Hollywood we might get a year where they get closer to 30% and then they come back down. As we've seen this year with Nomadland, women are making great films. And they are slowly getting nominated more, but those opportunities aren't there. And that judgment that I mentioned earlier, that prove yourself every time out, is still there, right? So where men are often allowed to fail. They might make a film that doesn't make as much money. They might make a film that artistically doesn't hold together, it gets bad reviews or whatever it is. And then the system will say to them, take another shot, Johnny. Oftentimes when women fail, Amy Heckerling, Elaine May, Penelope Spheris, it's really hard for them. It can take years or even decades for them to get back in the game of making films. Just look at what happened to Patty Jenkins after Monster, Academy Award winning film, and how long it takes her to be given the opportunity to make Wonder Woman. This is a fantastic filmmaker who's proven that she can do it. And still, I think when the second Wonder Woman film wasn't quite as well received as the first, there was some sort of Patty Jenkins. That doesn't happen to men. So yes, the world today is different, but not as different sometimes as we like to think it is. There's a program called 52 Films by Women where you challenge yourself to watch 52 films in a year directed by women. If you've watched this far in this video, I challenge you to do that. You don't have to start it in January. You can start right now. Starting in May till next May, you're going to watch one film a week directed by a woman. It's fascinating and it's eye-opening, and it'll change your ideas about not just women as directors, but film and film's potential. And isn't that one of the things that we want to do? There are a lot more women that we could talk about. I didn't mention the producers and women moving up in the ranks of production and eventually starting to run studios. It was a key development in the changes that came about into the 80s and 90s, where more women directors started to get hired. We can go all the way back to the early 70s when Julia Phillips became the first woman to win an Academy Award for Best Picture in the 70s, man. Come on. That was for The Sting, and Julia Phillips also had her hand in Taxi Driver, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. If you want to read a trip of a book, get your hands on Julia Phillips' book, You'll Never Eat Lunch in This Town Again. It's awesome, just for the fun of it, whether you like her or not, read that book. Women were doing costume design, Althea Silbert, and of course, continuing to play all those sort of far below the line roles that they rarely get credit for even today. That's all for now, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. That would be great for me. It helps me out a lot. And if you've seen a couple of my videos, why not subscribe? All it takes is the push of a button. I got a few more videos coming up in this series. Next up, blockbusters. Then we're going to talk about studio realignment and how the money came back in to control things. Then we're going to talk about director hubris, the big films that failed. And then I'll wrap it up with the conclusion. So 4 more videos in this series. I'm going to continue with what makes this film great. And I've got a new series coming up over the summer that's going to be shorter, sharper, and a lot of fun. And I think you guys are going to like it. So if that interests you, yeah, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. But until next time, my name's Ern Hunter, and keep watching movies.